Hi, everyone. A special note for this episode. Our discussion with Ron Crabtree went so well and so long that we wanted to make sure everyone benefited from the conversation. So we decided to split this recording into two episodes. So if it ends abruptly and it feels that way, then it's intentional. Just go to the next episode on your next opportunity and you'll see the full discussion. With that, have a great day and enjoy the recording.
Welcome, listeners, to the podcast. I'm Steve McKeon.
And this is Lupe Munoz, and this is the Leadership Exchange. Today, Steve, we got a great guest with us, Mr. Ron Crabtree. Ron, why don't you tell our guests a little bit about yourself?
All right, very good. It's an honor to be with you guys today. Thank you for inviting me to participate. And my background, I kind of grew up in the automotive industry in materials management and operations and worked my way up into materials management and plant management roles. Got moved to Detroit with United Technologies Automotive back in 96 and ended up being recruited out of there to have full P&L responsibility for a private equity carve-out. And then moved into consulting with Grant Thornton in Metro Detroit in operations improvement. Ran their Oracle practice for a period of time. And then I had a tour of duty with the world's largest lean manufacturing consulting company and got to work with a lot of Toyota folks in doing, value stream mapping and activity-based costing. Did a ton of work at Ford Motor Company at a number of their plants in North America. Got to learn a lot about that. And then after that, founded my company 22 years ago, MetaOps and MetaExperts, which we'll touch on briefly. And since then, since starting the company, I've been very involved with thought leadership and good leadership practices. I am a Master Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. I'm also a certified supply chain transformation architect and master instructor. And I've had the joy to work with just about every sort of industry in many countries with leadership teams grappling with transformation. All these things we want to do, like lean, for example, always easy to talk about, really hard to do. With that, I'll turn it back to you guys.
Yeah, Ron, thank you for that quick introduction. As we've got to know you over a couple conversations, it is a pleasure to have you join us just because of the, as you touched on, the experience, the industry knowledge. And then I know as we get into the podcast, some of the things that I'll be looking to just learn a little bit more about is the current state of lean practice and the introduction of some of the AI components that are out there, and as far as lean practitioners and new leaders in an organization, what do you look for in some of that space? So we'll get to that in a little bit, but why don't you start us off with a good story about leadership, lessons learned, either as a new leader in your career or just something maybe that you want to talk about in recent experience as well.
Well, I'm going to share a little mentor experience I had that was very formulative on me. This was back in 86, 87 time frame. So I'm going back quite a ways. And I was interviewing for a job as, a materials manager for an automotive supplier. And I sat down with my boss, Gary, who ended up being one of the best mentors I ever had in my life. And he wrote down 5 things on a piece of paper. And he said, I want you to force rank these in order of criticality. He had productivity, teamwork, safety, efficiency, like 5 different things. So I looked at that carefully. I was trying to anticipate what he'd really care about. So I ranked them. And he looks at me when I was done. He says, why was safety not number 1? And then he proceeded to lecture me about how in the world could you be a professional working in manufacturing and not recognize if it isn't safe, nothing else matters. So I kind of had my tail tucked between my legs thinking that was that interview. But he ended up hiring me, and we had a lot of good times together. So I learned a lot about being thoughtful as a leader, being careful what you ask for, and then make sure we understand the right priorities, and then align people around what's really important. And connecting to the what's in it for me is crucial if we want to lead people, whether we have position power or not.
It's a great story, Ron, and near and dear to my heart as a EHS safety professional in my career. It's interesting, and the listeners know a little bit about my story, but there was a point in my career where I was asked to turn over all my responsibilities in EHS and learn about this thing called lean manufacturing. And I didn't understand at the time what I was being asked to do. I actually thought about, hey, I better update my resume. This company's getting ready to move me out. But I saw the connectivity really quick, the importance of that safe environment in order for success in any organization that starts with that foundation. And so that was a great story to lead in with. Thank you.
Ron, first in your introduction, you said so many things that touched on things that we are excited about, things that we are passionate about on this podcast, which was, transformation, lean, and leadership. Obviously, those three can be very powerful if you're able to hone all three of them, almost like someone that makes armor knows how to combine metals, right, and make something incredibly powerful. Those three can be combined to do some amazing things. And I thought that one of the key things that you said was, sounds easy, but in reality, it's extremely hard. What do you see as the hardest thing for teams to be able to overcome, and more specifically, maybe leaders be able to overcome when they're trying to combine those three things?
Well, I think it's a moving target. And I was thinking about today's podcast and what we might talk about. There's been a shift in the last 25 years, right, for the kinds of leader skills that are going to really be successful. And I've got my own podcast I do called Metapod, which you can go to metapod.com and check that out. But I focus in on the three key challenges that leaders face in organizations, particularly those involved with tangible goods. It's the forever labor shortage. And if you're not aware of that, you need to do a little research. It's this endless pressure around digitization, digital transformation, AI changing the world. At least that's what people would like you to think. And then finally, this is relentless pressure to do more with less, logistics, space, people, equipment, it kind of goes back to an operational excellence or lean kind of thinking. And I've seen a lot of shift. 25 years ago, you need to be pretty autocratic about it. You would almost be anti-technology, in terms of, if I want to be successful with lean, for an example, let's really enable humans to do what they can. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I'll come back to that later. But one of the things that we're actually doing is a benchmark study around what do companies need to do to deal with the forever labor shortage problem. The fact that the size of the workforce in the United States, in particular North America and most Western countries, isn't going to get bigger. It's going to get smaller unless there's big changes to immigration policy or birth rates and things like that. It's on us as leaders to deal with that. And part of what we did is kind of listed out what were all those activities. And related to leadership, I saw a strong correlation around certain behaviors that we have to be really tuned into even more. When I was learning all this stuff 25 years ago, you could get away with being pretty autocratic, but times have changed. We're doing a benchmark study around that. And part of it was taking a look at what are the behaviors from a management perspective. So we took a look at, to be an employer of choice falls on management largely. We make all the decisions as leaders in terms of how our company is positioned to be, an employer of choice going forward. There was like 20 some different elements within that. And we discovered a couple of things so far. And this is, emerging, and this is going to be an ongoing dynamic study that we're going to be sharing out to the marketplace and with thought leaders going forward, is the generational differences of how we need to behave as leaders has shifted. So I'm just going to grab a piece of paper here because I can't keep it all in my head at one time. But, you've got us, myself, right, definitely born in the middle of the boomer generation. And then you've got, Gen X born in 1965 to 1980, Gen Y, 81 through 96, and then Gen Z born 1997 and since. Now, some of those folks are in their mid-20s now, approaching their mid-20s, right? And they're definitely in the workforce. And their needs have shifted and changed. So, for example, we talk about the company mission statement and what we're here to do and, what our company is all about. And, it's probably not going to impact the Gen Yers and Zs so much, right? They're a little less interested in that. They want to be part of something, but they're going to be a lot less interested than us boomers and some of the Gen Xers that are out there in the workforce. That's just an example. And if I think about, those 20-some different things, there's a couple things I highlighted here as leaders that I think are very important. And first is company culture. The thing about company culture, most of us get it, but we have to really be conscious of it, is culture is going to happen no matter what. Once you put 2 or 3 people together and you start to form an organization, a culture is going to emerge. So we get to decide as leaders, are we going to allow it to happen, or are we going to carefully define what the culture is going to be, the culture we want to, evidence as an organization to serve our customers, to serve our stakeholders, our employees, and our communities. And we're going to shape that culture purposefully. And that's on us. So it surprises me sometimes, executives say, yeah, we're going to be lean. We're going to become a lean organization. And they change nothing about their behaviors and what they're doing every day, right? They expect they can just delegate this and magically it's going to happen. And unfortunately, it's an 80% people problem when it comes to most transformation efforts.
Spot on with the culture piece. It's amazing that people say, hey, we are stating that we have a great culture and therefore we have one, which is a total falsehood. And I think in one of our discussions that we were having in preparation for this with you, I think you referred to the book around culture eats strategy for lunch.
Yeah, that's a Druckerism.
Absolutely. And do you see things from the perspective of what's important actually changing? Like, for example, culture. I feel like culture's always been the main thing, but what's been acceptable and what's not been acceptable maybe has shifted. Is that your perspective, or is there other changes that you see have played aside from the generations, right?
It is. I want to touch on a few more of these behavior things associated with, being an employer of choice. But we also have to couple that with, ESG, environmental, social, and governance mandates, funded and unfunded. This is really being driven pretty heavily out of Europe, and generally what's driven out of Europe follows in the Western world, North America. So we've got some things going on in the marketplace in terms of market expectations around our behaviors and the sorts of things we're doing, like avoiding slave labor and child labor, for example, or reducing carbon footprint or foods and textiles and things like that don't have chemicals, right? Things that can really affect us. So we've got all that to deal with. It's changing, the standard of what good leadership is. But then if we go back to when we think about, being an employer of choice is back on us as, leaders, managers of defining what we mean by that. And here's one, recognition. 25 years ago, it was pretty straightforward because we all kind of thought the same and had the same values. But with this generational thing going on in the workforce, one brush doesn't paint all colors here, right? You can't take one brush and paint everything the same. You've got to be really conscious of how we give recognition, how we engage people and make them part of what we're doing. They have different kinds of needs. And this comes back to being transparent. I'll talk about this later, but with digitization, the advent of all the electronic tools, I think about 25 years ago, we didn't really understand what it meant to have a cell phone, right? There are people born since, 1996 that have never known a world where everybody didn't have a cell phone, was completely connected at all times. So their needs and their expectations as they go in the workforce is going to be different. So being transparent is double-edged sword, right? As leaders, unlike ever in history, everything and anything we say or do, sometimes even in private, is going to get captured. And if it's incongruent with the culture and what you're trying to drive and behaviors in your organization, it's going to be a real problem. Employee engagement, right, in needs of people to be engaged has changed. It used to be if I just asked for my opinion, that was good enough. But nowadays with these new generations, they feel like they have to be involved, right? And they're not getting involved the way they would like to be. So that's going to be a real problem. And of course, development opportunities, that's a huge challenge. And this is something I'd like to encourage leaders to be very careful in thinking about is we've got to be developing the workforce of the future. And traditionally the boomers, right, have always been pretty closed, right, and not necessarily handing off and creating an environment to bring forward the newer people coming into the workforce to learn how to do things. My friend Alan Willett talks about the wisdom gap and that progressive leaders are thinking carefully around, okay, so what am I doing to set up a mentorship program? If I identified those future jobs a year from now, 3 years from now, 10 or 20 years from now, and am I setting up mentorship and development programs to get people ready to step into those jobs? Is that just part of my leadership psyche? And I think that's what the best leaders are getting more successful at, is being really critical thinking around developing that future workforce. And then being fair. Everybody's perception is fair is different, and this generational change has certainly impacted that. And then, of course, involvement. And that's the big challenge for us boomers is, we tend to be not so good at that, right? That's not our nature necessarily. And so we need to be cognizant of that. going forward.
Some great wisdom there. I just want to go back and talk about a couple of those points that you brought up. So, organizations that I work with over the years have, had this challenge for talent, right? Bringing talent in. And it doesn't matter if it's, labor talent around, a manufacturing sector, machine operation skills, or even maintenance type skills, but also the thought knowledge. And I think what you talk about there is spot on, is that as an organization and a leadership in an organization, and even a new leader going in, you've got to have a broader view of that world around you. You can't just be so microscopic into the, small micro needs that you have. And you got to kind of get a sense of, every move you make reflects on the organization, to the point where you could moves that you do that aren't popular, positive, and really start forcing people out of an organization. And although the rest of the organization may be somewhat healthy, once you start getting those kinks in the armor, then water starts to flow in and out, and you can't keep the ship floating. And I think that's, such a good key point to focus on, is that with the multi-generational workforce, understanding those needs to become that employer of choice. And that has to be a focused management decision. It can't be a part-time job. It has to become part of that DNA of just, this is how we operate. And you're right, for folks that have been in the field for a while, that have really kind of been take the mountain, task focused, and then, okay, what's next? We've had to learn to turn around and reflect, right? A lot of self-reflection on, where we've gone, because if we can capture some of those nuggets and learn from them, both the good and the bad, we set the stage for that advanced culture. So I love the, information that you're sharing here today, and really excited to, learn a little bit more about this study as you and your team focus on it and start to share some of those lessons learned. Kind of going back to one of the questions related to this, Ron, is let's talk about like a new leader coming into the organization with some of that mindset, and that maybe they're not in a key decision making position yet, but how can they start to focus on some of those key areas? Where should they focus some of their time and attention in that space to, one, help themselves in their role, but also the teams that they're going to be leading?
Yeah, I think there's two ways of looking at this. One is from the perspective of the current leadership that's responsible for these people entering as leaders in the organization. I get back to that wisdom gap thing. Do we have a structured development program in mind? Are we creating scenarios to put them under fire, under control? In other words, can we create specific opportunities for them to get, their nose bloodied by making mistakes and learning some of those hard things? You can hear about it, but until you've experienced some of the mistakes we make in business, you can't learn. I mean, most of us can't. I mean, some of us, can read about it and figure it out, but most of us are experiential learners. I mean, we got to go through being under fire, but, you can't throw them under the bus either, right? So we have to create those situations with controlled risk where we can allow them to try some things and learn. And sometimes they'll surprise the daylights out of us with innovations and different ways of tackling the problem that we just are blind to because of our experiences and the way we've always done it. And, I think of something to think about is if you do what you've always done and hope for a better result, that's a form of insanity. And that's credit, I think, to Henry Ford saying that, 100 years ago. So then on the other side of it, right, for newer leaders, who I'm hoping some of them are joining us to listen to this, if you're a newer leader coming into the organization, it's your opportunity to learn how to manage upward a little better. And I was very fortunate, this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, I had taken a job as a production scheduler, and I kind of took me a couple of months to get my arms around it, kind of come up with a system, and it was really getting pretty stable state, and we had a lot of really good results, but I was a little bored, right? So one day I walked down to my boss's office and I sat down with Dirk Hess, I think was his name. It was Becton and Dickinson out in Pasadena at the time. And I said, "Boss, you got anything else I could do? I'm getting a little bored." His chin almost hit the table, because I don't think you'd had anybody ever walk into his office and ask him that kind of a question. Can you give me more work? But that's something to think about, right? For younger people entering the workforce, we tend to be in the younger generations, more interested in work-life balance, and some other things are more important to us, which is fine. And at the same time, if you want the opportunity to be engaged, given the opportunity to take on some things and begin to learn, you've got to open yourself up to some risk here, and controlled risk nonetheless, but learn how to ask. Maybe you walk down to the HR organization, or if you're fortunate enough to have, a chief human relations officer or a workforce development officer of some sort. Tap into them, see what's going on at the company, and are there things I can or should be doing that allow me to learn and experience some things differently. So there's two sides to this, right? So from a top leadership perspective, we have to lay out an infrastructure and a game plan for those future leaders of the future. And on the other side of it, we need to invite them in and create a safe environment for them to open themselves up to some challenges.
One of the companies that Lupe and I have some experience with and conversations around talked about, some of their transformation that they went through to become a better company around op excellence and really driving the ship. And one of the things that they came back and said, we failed our mission here because we forgot to include that middle management frontline supervisor layer in all we were doing. So they were transforming the leadership team, really focusing on, that culture they wanted to have and experience. And they went right to the operations floor person from the brand new person coming in. And they completely alienated their middle management team, and those folks were lost. And so, as they had some big gains early on, they lost everything because they didn't they didn't make that connection of that culture throughout the organization. And I think, some of the watch outs for, leaders at both C-suite and also middle management is just to make sure that you continue that conversation, have that voice. The catch ball part of the Toyota dynamic is so important in that space because it's got to be up and down, and then horizontal through that organization. Really interesting points there. The other thing I would say generationally that I see is, and this is something that, we've probably all experienced in our career, but the fear of failure and the fact that it seems like the pressure on kids going to school now, coming out of school, being able to land, a really successful job in the current economy. And they feel like in some cases that they need to not fail. And to the point that we were just talking about, they need to learn. And the only way you're going to learn some things is to do trials and understand that not every trial is going to be a success, right? And I think that's, when you talk about development, recognition of new leaders in organizations, that's got to be so well stated early on. We know within boundaries, you're going to experiment. And I think sometimes using the word experiment versus work to fail and then learn from it, softens that a little bit, but basically the same thing, right? And so what's some of your thoughts in that space with this multi-generational workforce that we're dealing with these days?
Well, I want to touch on what you just said, and then I want to talk a little bit more about digital transformation and the effect of, digitization that leaders, need to be cognizant of from, leadership perspective. Now, I think back to, a story I heard about Toyota, right? They basically had this environment of, if you're 50, 60% right, we want you to try, right? And, we're okay with the mistakes being made. And then the other thing I found interesting is Toyota would say, working very hard to eliminate the opportunity for a defect. But if you find the defect, right, the unintended result in the business process, the product or whatever, when the defect was brought up, they would say, oh, we have a treasure. And that's completely different from punishing the messenger or, wait a minute, who messed up? Who are we going to punish? And they said, no, this is the treasure. The reason it's a treasure is as leaders, we let the organization down because we didn't take the effort to train, develop, put in the systems and processes to allow people to get it right the first time. So we are the failures as leadership because we failed to get in front of that. So we treat that as a treasure, as an opportunity to learn, go back and revisit things we've done, look for where our chinks in the armor were, and then begin to put something in place so we can eliminate the root cause, right, of that problem coming back to manifest. So that's a mindset thing, right? And it's creating an environment where it's safe to take risks, and it's also safe to make a mistake, under control, right? And there has to be some boundaries to that. But if you don't purposely create that environment, then you're going to have an environment of fear, people sitting back. Well, there's a term for that. They're not quiet quitting, but it's like just showing up. And we drive that just showing up behavior by the way we treat people in the organization when they do try things and maybe it doesn't work out. So anyway, I'm going to go on that. But I would want to take a couple minutes to talk about digital transformation and how that's a shift in the last 15, 20 years. It's pretty interesting. At the onset of the COVID pandemic back in 2020, one of our customers came to us and asked us to develop an all-new digital transformation awareness program that they could weave into their e-learning platform. This is a large global e-learning source company. So I grabbed some of our MetaExperts. These are the experts in our community of practice that we put out for interim projects. And I grabbed some folks that had some real deep technical expertise of what was going on. And we've kind of created this list of all the sorts of digital transformation technologies impacting us. And we came up with about 30 different things, just one of which was AI, which is the big thing now. We might come back and talk more about that. But in fact, there's a whole gaggle of things at the time, at least 30. And we built 9 different courses out of that, one around for each function in the organization. Which of these digital transformation technologies most impact sales, marketing, product development? Which ones impact supply chain? Which ones impacts finance and IT operations inside the organization? Which ones impact operations and quality? And then finally, what impacts people, right? HR and change management. And I highlighted a couple of those elements just to touch on these because as leaders, it's our job to understand what's coming, or at least be cognizant of it, recognizing we don't know what we don't know, learning to be open and listening, and then picking the right digital transformation elements and then leading the organization through adoption falls on us as leaders to be out in front of that and thinking about it. We just think about AI. And I don't think all the hype about AI replacing everybody's job is going to come to fruition. But I did hear something very interesting lately that I thought was very true, and that goes like this. Human being with AI will outperform human being without AI. And my big takeaway from that is we can't ignore it. But we have to be very attuned to, it's not a placebo, it's not fixing all of our problems, it's not the silver bullet, but it is an enabler. I think about just the productivity I've gained using AI note-taking for meetings like this, and how wonderfully it just buttons that up, gives you a nice, concise list of what we talked about, picks out what the action items were. I used to spend an hour or two agonizing over putting together notes after a meeting. I gained a lot of productivity. Well, think about all the different opportunities for that to be leveraged. But don't think about that as a silver bullet cure. How about performance risk management? That's a technology out there. Performance risk management always comes back to our people, ultimately. How well are we developing, teaching, and empowering them? What are the processes we're putting in place to prevent human error, right? Because the old saying is 100% human inspection is only 80 to 85% effective. So if we're expecting human beings to stop a defective result from getting to our customers or down into the process, and they're supposed to inspect in the quality, we're in trouble. And if we have a high reliance on people for the quality of the product or service we're providing, that's a major enterprise risk problem. Because if we're in a Six Sigma world making parts for aircraft, that's not going to fly, right? You're not going to crash airplanes. So our risks are going to be really tough. So that's just an element, of digital transformation we might be thinking about is, leveraging those tools. You have robotic process automation, and automation those trivial tasks that people probably don't want to do anyway, are prone to error, are great opportunities, and it frees up resources. So we kind of get back to the lean view of eliminating waste. Well, as you get down into process and you really take a look at what people spend time on, and you begin to analyze where technologies could come into play, could very well do some pretty cool stuff around taking away stuff people don't really need to be doing anyway and probably don't like doing, and freeing them up for more value-add activities that actually make a difference to our customer, creating opportunities for them to do more than they've ever done before. Unified collaboration tools, right, online, so we can actually share information more seamlessly across countries, across divisions, across functions. Very, very powerful. And I think there might be one more. A couple more. The people analytics part of it, there's tools out there around, capturing information just from analytics. So you can kind of have a feel for what's going on and how people are reacting to you. One of the things that scares me is most television being sold today actually have built-in cameras to try to watch for audience responses, advertising and stuff. And that's kind of scary. So it's alive and well. But, as leaders, we need to be aware those opportunities for us exist to really get feedback, right? This would be very, I'll call it leading indicator feedback in terms of message out, being received, message wrong, right? Are we scaring people? Are we getting them where we need to be? And then, video capture technology, some other cool stuff, all tend to impact, the people side of it. So that's all I want to say about that for the moment is, as leaders, we have to take the lead and say, okay, digitization is going to happen. And we get to choose if we're going to be rolled over because we didn't adopt quick enough, or we're going to be an early, a leader or a fast follower, and then be very selective. My argument is digital transformation, all these AI tools, not a panacea. It's death by 1,000 cuts. So you're going to be very careful to select carefully which tools and elements you're going to be applying, have a very specific outcome with respect to the impact on your people, process, and technology. You need to do those in rapid sprints because everything's going to change in 90 days anyway, right? The assumptions we made and the technologies are moving all the time. And that's our job, is another piece of that. So people, process, and technology falls back on us as leaders.
When some people think of technology, there's a fair or unfair stereotype around, hey, more technology or technology is cold. And how does that really fit into the piece around culture? Does it work against it? Does it augment it, or neither?
Ideally, it improves the culture because we're enabling the sharing of the knowledge. We're enabling the reinforcement of the behaviors we're looking for. We're enabling the connection of people to come together when there is a disagreement, when we do have the problem, when there is the misunderstanding. And we can accelerate the speed at which we break through those things and move on, right, to the better solution. I think that's, we need to look at technologies and find ways to make them work for us and not against us. So if we're using the technologies to alienate people, replace people, and not communicating and really building out where we're going to go and how we're going to put those people in other things, then we're probably missing the boat.
One of the things that specifically I had in my mind, and I'd love your perspective on this, because now you've got me questioning some of my thoughts, and which is great, right? For example, lean use of the Gemba board. For those people that are not familiar with Gemba board, I would describe it as it's a visual tool on the work floor that helps you identify problems and then should facilitate helping you fix a problem for the team members. And it's very engaging, collaborative process tool that you use within the lean management system. Given that, I'm a big proponent of staying away from the digital Gemba board, because my belief is that, hey, that interaction, that human interaction of people updating it physically and writing down, for example, writing down the green we're passing or the red, there's a connection there that allows more engagement than if auto-populated, so to speak. What's your perspective on that? Because you've got me thinking a little bit more like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be so close-minded about digitizing those types of tools based on some of the great perspective you're providing us.
Yeah, then we have to start, you have to take a tiny step back and say, what's the team involved, right? Who needs to be involved? Why do they need to be involved? What are the mechanisms we have to share the information necessary for them to be successful? So I like what you said. I'm a big proponent. If I'm going to put people in a room, I want to be on wall charts and flip charts and whiteboards, right? And make that highly interactive because there's something really powerful about visual. Continually visual as we're learning and engaging around the topic. There's, from a human experience perspective and a transfer of knowledge and getting agreement and understanding, it's a wonderful technique. Well, you lose that when you drop down to the size of a screen, right? So it's contextual. If you're out on the shop floor and we're very focused in on making the product or the distribution line or the machine or whatever, and we have a small team, then we need to be very huddled around that. The visual board's probably fine. But then as your team starts to expand, and I need people who aren't even in that plant involved, I need suppliers upstream to be getting information and feedback because they're going to be shipping materials or information to me to process. Maybe I even need my customers involved because our customers can also be our suppliers, right? They may supply us product that we got to convert, ship back to them. They supply us information about demand and changes in the market that we have to convert and push back out to them as a service. So I think it's contextual. And the more you move to, it's not possible to have the workforce in the physical space as that team begins to morph out. That's where unified collaboration tools and digital Gemba boards would begin to be very powerful. So I see it as contextual.
Fantastic. You've helped me frame up when that may be the case and when it maybe not be the case. So thank you very much for clarifying that.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. It's been hard to get Lupe out of that space, so I appreciate it.
Come on, Steve. Give you a little credit.
Hey,
Hello, everyone. It's me again. As mentioned at the start of the episode, this is part 1 of 2 episodes with Ron Crabtree. Please join us on the next episode to continue the conversation with us. As always, this is the Leadership Exchange with Steve McKeon and Lupe Munoz. Everyone have a great day.